Hey there, I'm Ryan, and welcome to today's acrylic landscape lesson. All of the tools and materials will be listed in the video description, and if you'd like help with the drawing process, I will have the traceable up over on Patreon. If you're interested, check it out. But with that, let's jump in and have some fun. We're going to begin here today with a 1-inch flat-headed brush, which I will dip the bottom third of into a little bit of water and then proceed to wipe off the excess. This will help keep our paint wet for a longer period of time and condense our bristles. With that, here on my palette, I have a sap green, titanium white, Mars black, and burnt umber. We're going to start with a mid-value in the background and then work our way forwards. So here, I'm going to grab some titanium white, move that to a clean spot on our palette. I'll grab about 1/3 of it in Mars black, and this will render a fairly neutral to slightly dark gray. And then we're going to interject some color with our sap green, and I'll use a similar amount to the titanium white. Then, to make it a little bit earthy, I'll grab a hint of our burnt umber. And while I like this color a lot, for the mid-value, I think it could be a little bit darker. So I'll slowly re-interject some Mars black. You don't want to use too much initially because it is a lot stronger than all of the other pigments and easy to overdo. That said, once I have a pigment I'm quite fond of, I'm going to head into the canvas, and I'm going to apply this predominantly, as you can see, in an X-shaped pattern. Now I'll cover all of the foliage in the top left-hand corner. We can redraw that in later. And I will work around the larger foliage that we have towards the left-hand side of the canvas, just because it's a lot larger than the foliage that we had up here and easy to work around. With that, let's get you a little bit closer. So we'll head back in here, and something you'll notice now that we are quite a bit closer is that I'm not dragging my paint very far. I'm not making it to the point where you can see the canvas underneath. I want fairly thick applications. And I'm also overlapping the edge of our waterfall. In fact, you can go over the entirety of it if you'd like. But let's start working on the other side. Now, yet again, heading up towards the top, working in an X-shaped pattern, and that's just so I'm not only moving the paint horizontally, but I'm also moving it vertically. So it just spreads paint a lot faster, and when you're working with acrylics, typically that's an asset because it makes blending a whole lot easier when dealing with dry time. That said, I don't want to completely dodge the waterfall in the middle. So what I'm going to do there is I'm going to make a similar pigment, but it's just going to be more gray. We'll still have some green, we'll still have some burnt umber, and I'm doing this so that we have a nice base layer for it, because acrylics will always show to a point the color that's underneath, and while we will have a lot of greens underneath, we'll also have rock that's a bit more exposed, as the water will make it difficult for the greenery to grow directly underneath, right? So I want a bit more rock through here, and I'll just softly blend it into the green. We'll cover up the transitions between the two with foliage and water, so don't worry too much if it isn't the most aesthetic thing currently. It's all part of the process. Now, I wasn't quite finished with this area over here towards the right-hand side, so we'll just do so. And it's worth noting, as I continue to work downwards here, there's going to be more exposed rock, again, because of the running water. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take the excess off my brush on a little towel. Then I'm going to go back to this pigment, if not making it a little bit more brown than what it was. So I'm mixing right beside my previous mixture so that I have something to work off of and make sure that it'll be cohesive enough with what we're doing, but also moving in the direction that we want it to. So there we go, a little bit more brown, but still green. I'll move down to where we have the water from the waterfall, and this brush is fantastic because we can render a nice sharp marking very easily. It's very versatile, carries a lot of paint, and that's why we initially picked it up, but when you need to work around rocks or sharp horizons, anything of that nature, it is incredibly useful. So we'll just blend it up into the green. We can have a soft transition, we can have a harsh transition. Either is fine, as we are going to do a lot of layering on top, but we do want a thick base layer, so do make sure that you have enough paint on the canvas. And if you feel like it's thin and you can kind of see the canvas showing through, it looks a little toothy, do consider letting it dry, doing a second layer, and then coming back in. But I did use a fair abundance of paint, and I didn't drag it very far. So it was thick throughout the application. So I don't think I'll have to, but it is something to consider with just about all of your paintings. Now, once our backdrop is fully dry to the touch, we're going to continue using that 1-inch flat to mix a brand new pigment, a much darker pigment. So what I'll do is I'll grab my sap green, work it right beside our previous mixture, grab a good amount of Mars black, hint of titanium white. We're essentially switching up how much Mars black and titanium white we used in the first mixture. I'll grab a hint of our burnt umber just to make it nice and earthy, and I'll go back and forth between the Mars black and the green until we have something saturated, but really quite dark in relation to everything else that we have. So it's not black, it still has quite a bit of hue in it, some of which earthy, some of which in the green, and then I'm going to switch to a new brush, that being the stiff bristled fan brush. We're not going to wet this one because we don't want the bristles to condense, or we'll head in, not grab too much paint, but we'll grab pigment on both sides of our brush. And then we're going to create texture where the foliage will be via a tapping motion. As you can see right here, this is just going to render myriad of darker shadows that will show through foliage that we place on top of it. So right now, we're really just focusing on layering. This layer will look quite awkward for the time being, and I preface that so that you don't get discouraged with your work. Acrylic painting is a lot like building a house. You start with a very not so aesthetic foundation, and then you build, you add, you over time create something really beautiful. And we are just pouring that foundation. If you've watched the videos on the channel before, you know that I really like using that analogy, just because it's easy to get disheartened in your work when you spend half an hour on something and it doesn't look the way you want it to yet, but you could be doing everything right, absolutely everything, and it just might not look great because it's not supposed to yet. But you give it the time and it'll get there. So here we go. This is all for foliage, by the way. We're going to tackle rock very soon, and we're going to do that in a different manner. With that, looks like the sun is going down. It's getting a little bit darker in here, so I'll turn up the camera and also give you a bit of a closer look. So here we are, quite a bit closer. Camera's a little bit brighter. You can see that I'm rotating my brush through these taps, but I'm never rotating once the brush hits the canvas. All of the rotation occurs in the air beforehand, and that's important because we don't want to render streaks on the canvas, we want taps. I'm also when I apply this, not pressing the entirety of the brush into the canvas. I'm tapping lightly, and I'm only using about 1/3 of the brush in the process. That way I don't get extremely long lines. I get the smaller bursts of pattern and pigment, which is much more easily controllable, and I can make it look randomized to a greater degree. I'm also going to go back over previously applied areas once I almost fully run out of pigment, and then we can just get a little bit of a speckled look, fill in the still open negative space. Let's move back up. Now again, we are going to get to rock fairly soon, and that will be done with a different technique, as will the waterfall itself. But we don't want to get ahead of ourselves. And to be honest, this part of the process is very cathartic. Have a lot of fun. You're essentially attempting to create a lot of randomization. So it's not a high pressure scenario. Sometimes you're painting detail or you're doing a large blend and it takes a lot of attention. It takes a lot of focus. Where this, you can kind of just enjoy the process of applying pigment to canvas in a loose manner. And if you find that your applications are looking a little too stiff or a little too meditated, if it looks very similar one area to another, try, instead of holding your brush like this, holding the brush farther back. You yourself can stand farther back from the canvas. It'll give you better visual perspective, so you can compare and contrast areas before they get too similar. But additionally, you relinquish some level of control with your brush, which sounds intimidating or perhaps even unintuitive, but when the goal is randomization, you want to take all of your inherent application processes and make them less dominant, right? And that's very much what we do when we hold the brush farther back, make the process a little bit more difficult for ourselves. That said, we are about to enter rock. This application, this color is about to change. So I'll just let this run out, and then we'll go back to mixing on the palette, but with not this brush, because we don't want too much pigment to accumulate on it. Also, when you're done with this, that's when you apply water, or when you can tell the paint is starting to dry on it. Mine still hasn't, I'm good. But if you do need to do that mid-process, wash it, dry it fully, and then come back to this, but make sure it's dry. So with that, next step. So back with the 1-inch flat-headed brush, still have some of this mixture on the brush, probably, admittedly, should have cleaned it, but it's okay, the paint is still wet. Now I want a significantly more burnt umber and gray mix. So I'm doubling down on the titanium white burnt umber. We'll still use a good amount of Mars black, but not too much to the point where we don't see the brown in the mix anymore. And you can see that I'm slightly overlapping the previous mixture. That's so, again, we can compare and contrast, but also so that I can grab a little bit of the green that's pre-existing within it, so I don't have to grab from here. There we go. Going to get the majority of the paint off my brush. Switch back over to the fan. Again, don't grab too much paint, but for the rocks down here, we're going to have a bit of a shelving look. It isn't hyper prominent in the reference photo, but I do recommend occasionally taking artistic liberties when you have a vision, when you have inspiration. Typically, reference photos are great for getting us started, giving us a unique look, providing information that we wouldn't innately have or come to the realization of in our own render. So with this, as you can see, colors changed, but so has the application style. There was a lot of rotation up here, And down here with the rock, it's really just a lot of vertical, or rather horizontal tapping. No vertical tapping, almost none. So we're almost creating a brick-like effect. Sometimes keeping openings, but we're trying to make it significantly more organic. And then we'll have some rocks up here that I can see in the reference photo, and they're a bit more rounded. One goes like this. So I'll move my brush predominantly in that motion, but I'll also rotate it so that we get some other unique markings. So we have our initial intentional one, and then we have something to make it a bit more randomized. I'm also trying to work in some horizontal markings similar to this towards the right hand side, and then they turn into that rounded and more unique abstract shape. There we go. And then we can do some more randomized tapping up here, akin to what we had with that. And we can overlap them. Now though, I do want more of the green to bring down. So, 1 inch flat, Mars black, titanium white, an abundance of green, a little bit of burnt umber. We've made this mix numerous times, so it should get easier and easier. We can get to that mix faster. There we go. Again, getting the majority off my brush. Switching back over to the fan. You can even curate a combination of the two for the transition, should you want to. Just trying to make it as natural looking as possible. And we can even work some of this darker green into the rock down here, because there will be greenery within it, there will be moss, and we want it to feel cohesive. It also isn't a dramatic difference, but it's the subtle differences like this that will add up and cumulatively make something really special. Now, yet again, we're backing up. I'm grabbing more of the brown that we used within there. And we can continue the rock formation should we want to in the movements that are pre-existing. But I do want slightly more randomization, and as we get higher, we move out of the zone of predetermined rocks, we're going to create other intentional rock forms by just choosing essentially a boulder size. So here's a boulder, and we'll bring it slightly into the greenery. Let's create another one. This time I'll work this way, so different angle, try to go for a slightly different size. And right now, of course, they don't look like rocks, but we'll get there. We will get there. Now, I just cleaned the fan brush, and I wanted to show you how the bristles are condensed post-water, and this is why we typically try to avoid getting this brush wet earlier on and when we're actually using it to paint. Now we can dry it and continue using it, or we can just let it dry if we are done with it, but just something to be aware of through your painting process. Now, once everything is fully dry to the touch, we're going to go to what is essentially our mixing brush for this lesson, the 1 inch flat, and we'll render a brighter green than what we have here, but it's still not going to be that bright. So I'm going to mix it beside the mid green that we had. This one can be a bit more saturated. It's for foliage that is closer, so it's going to get a little bit more light, and we can make it more green than gray. but I want to be able to build up these bright pigments over time, so I don't want it to be actually bright, not yet, just bright in relation to what else we have. So this will actually be a great pigment right there. Put that brush down, and we'll pick up, for the first time, our liner brush. This one is fantastic for rendering individual small markings. They won't be as small as what we rendered with the fan brush, as that rendered individual spots for each bristle, where this is an accumulation of bristles. So while it is technically our smallest brush, it's not going to give us the smallest marking, and that's okay because this is going to render individual leaves, where these are shadows and implications of leaves in the background that are a little bit farther away. So we'll make sure this is nice and damp to condense the bristles, unlike the fan brush. We'll grab some of our pigment, and I'm going to look for where the waterfall is. I can tell because of the color distinction. And I go in to tap some individual leaves, and immediately I can tell it's not quite bright enough. It doesn't have enough saturation. It doesn't stand out to the extent and degree that we want. Why is that? Considering it looks like this on here and it doesn't look like that there. It's because, again, acrylic paints are semi-transparent, and they will show the pigment that is under them to a fairly decent degree. So if you want to bright pigment, you kind of need to build up the base layers a little bit, or go in with an even brighter pigment than what you intended, because it'll balance out. So we go for an even brighter pigment. I don't want something this bright, and that's okay because it's not going to be that bright on the canvas. But we'll go in and we'll start working on individual little leaves. Now, these are going to be made predominantly with a tap and a drag, and then I alleviate pressure. So I go in with the smallest amount of pressure possible, and then I apply more, and then I apply less, and then I take the brush off. And what this accomplishes is a sharp entry point, a more full body to the leaf, and then a sharper bottom to it. So you get dimension in them simply by altering the amount of pressure you have with your brush. Now we have clusters of darker areas, and I'm going to avoid quite a few of them. They were randomly generated through our tapping experience previously, and they are going to be the more inset shadows, okay? Some foliage is farther out than others. The foliage that is deeper in is darker, and the more variance we can create, the more depth we'll have, all right? So if we went in with an even brighter rendering of this foliage, then we'd have 4 different values of green, right? We have the mid value we applied initially. We'd have the darker value we applied for the second layer, this for the third, and then the greater highlight for the potential fourth. We might do that, but we might not on this side because the light's going to be coming from this side, really here-ish, but higher, but definitely towards the right. So I'm applying a lot of this with the thought that it's not getting a massive amount of light, and the light that it is getting is fairly uniform. So there isn't a great gradient or anything unusual. It's a very easy entry point, which is nice. I typically like to start paintings with something easier, so I can mentally get into the process of painting without too much challenge or difficulty. And then, as I get warmed up, as those motor skills get firing, then we enter the more challenging but rewarding portions, right? Here we're still doing more of this. I'm not going to do as many up towards the top left because I do want to create a little bit of a vignette effect. And if you haven't watched the channel before, a vignette is essentially a slightly darker border, and you apply them in paintings and photographs, all of that, because the eye innately goes to the brightest point of any piece. And if you can keep the center or the primary subject brighter than the edges, it'll keep the viewer's eye within the image for a longer period of time. It's one of those subconscious little tricks you can incorporate to just have the viewer engage a bit longer. Also, this is a technique that we're using on the left-hand side. It will change dramatically as we move towards the right and work around the rocks. We're also going to be doing something completely different in the waterfall. But right now, I'm just, again, trying to create little clusters, looking for the darker areas to avoid, create that randomization, but also ensure that we have a lot of depth within what we're doing. And this brush is just working so well. You can see that I make it damp, I grab some paint, and then I'm able to make so many nice markings. And, exciting news, the brush set, this is from our custom brush line, been working on it for the last number of months. It is now partially up on the website. So there's a link in the video description where you can now go and sign up to get an email when the brush set is released. It's going to be a limited release. We're only doing 500 units for the first release. So if you really want to make sure that you get it before it sells out, I do recommend signing up to that email in the description. It is a 5-piece brush set. Comes with the 1-inch flat that we were working with, the stiff fan brush that I used to create all of these sharper markings, the liner brush I'm currently working with. It also has a filbert that we will grab a little bit later in the lesson, and it has a smaller flat inch which will be great for cityscapes that we'll do in the very near future. So if you haven't already, do sign up. Link will be in the video description. It'll be up on the Patreon post. Trying to make it quite easy to find for everybody, because again, it will be limited launch, and I just want to make sure that the people who really do want it are aware, are ready, and have that opportunity. I'm pretty excited because if you've been following the channel for years at this point, I've had paints that I like, Winsor & Newton currently, what I'm using predominantly, but I've never had a singular brush set or brand that I've fallen in love with. And so I've always just used a random collection of brushes. And whenever anybody asks what brushes should I buy, it's always, well, you can buy this set, but it won't really have this. And you can buy that set, but maybe the bristles kind of come out a little bit more than you'd like. Or it's always with a series of asterisks. Or, you know, you can buy these 3 sets and then you'll have a good collection for following along with my lessons. But you don't really want to recommend somebody have to buy 3 sets. And you end up with 30 brushes and you use 5 of them. So finally put together a set essentially for the channel. And what's really cool is it's entirely cruelty-free. It's a synthetic brush set. I have never used and have always very strongly avoided using real hair in my brushes. I think synthetic just works a lot better with acrylics, but B, ethically, I'm just not one to support that. So if you're like me, that's exciting news. With that, I've been painting these little taps for quite some time, and I can't bring the greenery down here because I have to do the rocks first and then layer the greenery on top of the rocks. So we're going to take a break from the greenery. We'll do our rocks. We'll do the greenery that covers the rocks. We'll come back to this, build it up so that it has a bit more volume, it has a bit more depth to it. Then we can start working on the waterfall and everything else. Now for the rock at the bottom here, I'm going to start with some burnt umber, head around where our previous darker mixture of the burnt umber was. We'll grab about half that in titanium white, then we'll add maybe a fifth in Mars black, and a hint of our sap green, just so it's nice and cohesive with everything else. Get the majority of the mix off our brush, switch over to the liner brush, make sure it's nice and damp, grab some pigment, and as I noted, a lot of the rocks down here are much more in sheets, essentially. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to tap on this mixture, but I'm going to do so in a lot of horizontal patterns. And here you can see it really standing out next to a lot of the darker mixtures, but I'm not going to cover all of the mid values, and I'm not going to cover all of the darker portions. Much like the greenery above, I'm looking for a wide variety of values, and that is best achieved by leaving our initial layers still somewhat visible. That said, while I like this, I do think it could be a little bit brighter. Again, one of those cases of much brighter on here than it is on the actual canvas because we have such a dark base layer. So I'll add some extra titanium white, and I'll also throw in a little bit of extra green and burnt umber. Now this is much brighter than what I actually want it to end up looking like, but because we're using a watery brush and acrylics, it shouldn't be too stark. So here, again, working on the elongated markings, tapping in extra little pieces to it. And you can see that I'm trying to create unique shapes. So while we're doing a lot of horizontal markings, they are fitting together in interesting ways. Here we'll do another one. And the first couple of marks are of course going to be the most visually prominent. So do start in areas that you're okay with being a little bit more bold than the rest. Typically that's going to be towards the top of the rock because the light is coming down on it. Now we're quite far down in this area, so we're not going to get a massive amount of light, but the light that does come down will have a particular effect, and it's important that we take that into consideration when rendering these rocks and their defining markings. See how this is all working horizontally? Some of the rocks are distinct, some of them kind of sink into one another, creating a bit more ambiguous shapes and ends to them, which isn't a bad thing. Again, we want them to look unique above all. And if it's not easily distinguishable, chances are it's very unique. Now we're not going to do all of it with this singular pigment, but towards the bottom, where there's going to be less greenery, I will use it in a greater abundance, as you can see. Though I don't want it to become too bright, because again, the farther down we get, the darker it should get. So you can use either a little bit more water, so it's more semi-transparent, so you see the darker pigment show through to a greater degree, or alternatively, you can make the pigment a little bit darker. Really whatever you're personally comfortable with. Now, heading back up, filling that in. You can see there is a bit of a roundness to what we're about to start doing. Comes down into here. Starting to create that depth. We can go over previously applied areas we like that we really want to bring out and add to them as well. We're almost done with this pure pigment. Just have a little bit more to do. Going to ignore form slightly more and lean into this dip. It acts as a leading line as well. You can see that it's slowly moving in. And I'd also like to mention a lot of the foliage on the left hand side is pointing inwards, and a lot of the foliage on the right hand side will be pointing inwards as well. So they're kind of moving towards the center. And we try to do that a little bit with all of our subjects, at least subtly, so that we have something very cohesive and we ensure that the viewer's eye is always moving towards the main subject or the area in which we really want to put attention. So I like a lot of these rocks. We'll start moving into where the waterfall is, but not to a great degree, and I'll let the pigment really run out, because I don't want too much light from this to show through the water. This really shouldn't be getting much light because of the water, so we're just going for a bit of a subtle detail, like that. Now, as we get higher, things need to start changing. We need a transition between the current color and the green. So I still have some of it on my brush, which is very convenient. We're going to head just to the left of our current mixture, throw in some green, add the brown, and we just want something of a similar brightness, but with green in it. And we can also compare it with what we have down here, and this is a nice earthy green. In comparison, this one's a bit more lush, has a bit of a cool tone to it. So we'll grab the new one. And again, this is essentially a rock with this mossy green, but you have the dirt on it as well. And it is acting as a leading line, bringing us down. And it's not a perfect arch. It's quite a bit more unique. You want little areas that kind of indent. There we are. We'll just connect a couple of these pieces. I tried to start by making lots of little markings that are a bit farther apart, and then I find ways of bringing them together. And that might be occasionally going over the darker separating areas. Again, you don't want to do that too frequently because it really is a resource to utilize with your depth. but there are going to be portions where you are just going to want to bring things together, and that's a great way of going about it in, again, minimal amounts. And here I'm going in and I'm doing some tapping, but I'm not tapping, dragging, and then letting off. I'm getting a bit more of a round look, or just creating kind of obtuse shapes within this, because again, it's a large rock, it is moss, and what we're essentially painting are the protruding areas, the areas that come up that catch additional light. So we can make them all very unique. Something I feel like I've mentioned a couple of times in this lesson, and I hope I remember to mention it a dozen more, because it is so imperative in making the finished version of this look gorgeous. Now, you've seen the finished version. You've seen the thumbnail of the video. I'm still working towards it. Sometimes with these paintings, more than I'd like to admit, I do the painting, I do the lesson, I look at it and I say, oh, you know what? We could do that better. Or I could arrange the way that we do things to be a better lesson, where the painting might come out great, but I feel like I could teach it better. So then I'll end up redoing it. And in a lot of those scenarios, I do know what it'll look like for the most part because I've already done it. But so far, I really like it. And it is my first time doing this painting. I have a vision of what it will look like. We have the reference photo, the traceable, but it's still somewhat ambiguous to me, which is fun. I like that a lot. I think that's a good movement. We can work a little bit of it in between our rocks as well, and we can build up the highlights that we really like. Upon applying a second layer, as you can tell, it gets brighter, and that's because we're applying a light layer on top of a light layer rather than a light layer on top of a dark layer. And this is how we achieve the pigment that we actually have on the palette for the most part. You just slowly build up this pigment over time, you let the underlayer dry, and then you go back in and you do it again. Here you can see we're slowly working it down, interjecting it into previously established areas. I'll throw this onto some of the more brown rock sheet as we progressively work down. Again, it's all about creating a transition from the brown up to the green, and doing that through textured applications is a great way of doing so. We can also work it behind the waterfall to a small extent. Again, wait till you don't have much pigment on your brush. You don't want it to be too bright, because you don't want it to show through the water to a grand degree. So I have new paint. I want to fill this in a little bit, but I'm not going to start there because I know it'll be too dominant. I need to work off a good portion of this paint before I can safely move into this area and just define some of the shapes. But you can see it's all working as we intended initially. I'm not going to do too much more of this, but we can instigate a second rock up here, and I'm just doing the top first to get an idea of where I want it. That said, I don't want it to be too dominant, so I'm not too concerned, and I intend to apply some of the foliage from above into it. So hopefully it gets somewhat lost. Typically when we start painting, we want to make every area really stand out, be gorgeous, be unique, and, you know, steal the show. But if you do that, then you end up with an unbalanced painting. One where the eye doesn't really know where to go, and the main subject doesn't get the attention it should have. It kind of gets lost in a lot of noise. So a big part of learning to paint is learning to simplify, let areas get lost, accept that areas that you painted that you really love should be painted over, and that's all okay. It's part of the process. And even if you painted something that you love and it makes sense to paint over it, that's okay, because you learned a lot in that process. You became a better painter. You achieved something that you can now recreate to a better degree the next time you need to render it. That is honestly much more valuable than a singular painting. Having the skill and the knowledge to go out and visually build what you want to, that's what we're really working towards. While a lot of these lessons are meant to teach you how to paint something specific and kind of take you along through my journey in doing so, the real goal is to teach you the techniques, the habits, so that you can see a reference photo, you can take a picture yourself, you can have a vision in your mind, and you can render that as well. It's not just about painting these the way that I paint them, it's about taking the larger ideas and integrating them into your works later down the line when you feel comfortable to do so. That's why in these lessons, I talk so much. I try not to just tell you what I'm doing, but how I'm doing it and why I'm doing it. That way, again, you have a greater understanding of the type of subject and you can integrate it later in your own work. In your own unique work. This is still your work. If you're creating this, I feel like it is as much yours as it is mine. Also, you're more than welcome to sell pieces that you make based off of my acrylic lessons. I get that question all the time. And a goal here is to make you a stronger artist, but also to help you on your journey of being an artist. And that means also financially turning it into something, right? Because if you do that, then you can spend more time painting. Very much like I thankfully, gratefully have the opportunity to do here. Wouldn't be able to do this without you watching these videos, supporting the channel, doing all that you do. Big thank you to everybody up over on Patreon, by the way, for literally making these lessons happen. The channel is predominantly community funded, and it is in large part because of you. So big thank you. Try to say it every lesson. Wish I could say it 100 times in every lesson because it means a lot. And I love that I have the opportunity to do this here for you. So big thank you. By the way, I'm mixing this color. Started recreating it up there. I'm going to bring it back down here so that I can make sure that it matches what we were previously doing in that foliage, and then I'll bring it back over here just so I can see that it's cohesive with the color that we currently have. That said, on the note of Patreon and all of that, if you are new to the channel, up over there you can get access to the traceable to help you with the drawing process. You can find pictures of all of the materials. You can get access to a bunch of bonus lessons that are exclusively up there, including big ones that are 24 by 36 inches. On top of that, we also have an exclusive Facebook group where everybody shares their artwork and their renditions. It's a great place to kind of get ideas, see how everybody's taking these in unique directions, and get feedback on your own work from different members of the community. You can also get access to all of my ebooks, including Acrylics for Beginners, which is essentially the essentials. Everything you need to know about acrylic painting before you jump into your first acrylic painting. So there's a great artistic community. There is knowledge via ebooks. There are helpful things, again, like traceables, reference photos, visuals of the material list, all of that good stuff. So if you're interested in any or all, check it out in the video description, where again you can also find the link to these brushes. By the way, the final version isn't going to have gold on the tip. Still using a prototype for this lesson. I'm going to do an unboxing of the final version of the brushes very soon. Excited to show you that. But lots of exciting things. The point of this was just to note that the video description is a good place to read once in a while. Try to do a little description of what the painting is, and then it's essentially just a resource list. You can also just read all of the different materials and everything that I use in the video description, and I always link the reference photo too. So plenty to check out there. Used to keep a blog on a website, and it just seemed like it made more sense to just update everybody in the video descriptions. That way you don't have to go to another website. You can see how it transitions one end to the next. And we can even incorporate a little bit of this down into the rock in different areas. Just kind of coming out in different spots. The green is slightly different, so it'll be unique and interesting, but still subtle because it's not a grand difference. Now we have texture, we have detail, we have a variety of subjects, but it's all looking a little flat. We need to start enhancing some of those details and building that depth. So yet again, mixing brush, we'll grab our sap green. This is all dry, so I'm not worried about kind of cross-contamination. I'll grab about an equal mixture in titanium white, the smallest amount of burnt umber maybe, and you know what, I'm second guessing it, I took it all off. Never mind. We'll also grab a hint of Mars Black, and I do mean a hint. We want a very small amount, which we can slowly interject in there. I'm looking for a brighter green than what we've previously worked with, but nothing that's extremely bright or extremely saturated. I would still want room to change it, make it brighter, continue to build, and I think this will be a really good next step. So, switching to the liner brush, it is nice and damp. I'm heading to the top right of the canvas, and the light again is right up here, so it's coming down. It conflicts to a small degree with the initial idea of creating a vignette, but we can break that rule in a singular corner. That singular corner will be the top right hand side, and we will have it coming in from the top, and we'll slowly let it dissipate as we move down to the left and diagonally. That said, I'm not just going to apply a singular amount. Did go back to my brush, or I did go back to my palette. Sorry, admittedly, I have food in the oven. I'm getting very excited about a lunch break. And I think I'm just a little distracted. But actually, I'd like to note that. I'd like to emphasize that. because often paint for extended periods of time, we forget to eat. It's natural, happens to all of us. But the large issue in it is that most of us, myself included, we get a bit of a shaky hand when we don't eat for a long period of time. I know mine can be quite bad. And there are a couple of things you can do to remedy that. One, take your pinky finger, as I am, rest it on the canvas. That will eliminate some amount of shake so you can get sharper markings for your foliage, as I am rendering here. Though, the true fix, the best fix, is to take a little bit of a break and have some food, as I am going to do very shortly. So make sure that you stay hydrated, make sure that you are feeding yourself semi-frequently, as you should, and it will genuinely make your paintings better. Also, I think a lot of us get a little hangry, or at least have issue holding focus for a long period of time when we're hungry. And patience is so important in painting. You really want to be able to take your time, respect the work you're doing, be mindful of the strokes. And so eating is actually a really big tip for creating successful paintings that take longer periods of time, like a lot of what you'll find on this channel. So do consider that. You can see how it feels like there's a light on that right hand side. It's coming in. That's what we're going after. And when I need to apply new paint, I typically like to start back up at the top here. Just make sure that it's nice and bright. And then I take the residual paint and I work it towards the edges. That way it isn't too strong. That said, we can have areas of foliage that protrude, and I can see it in the reference photo. And this area right down here protrudes. So I'm actually going to start with some light down here. So it's bright, and then it gets a little darker, and then here, brighter again. Because this sticks out, it doesn't have shadow covering the entirety of it. And then it can dissipate as it gets farther down as you move towards these rocks, right? And much like the top, best achieved with a couple of layers and applications. If you let it dry first, it will look better. It'll be more stark. You get more of the natural color that you have on your palette. There we go. We also need to do some highlights in our rock area. Okay, so now while we wait for that top area to dry, we are back down here, and as I'm sure you guessed, we are with a slightly brighter variant of what we previously worked with. It can be more saturated, it can be less, so I'm actually going to make a very inconsistent mixture. This is something I very rarely do, but here you can see it's more gray, here it's more brown, and I'm very purposefully creating something that's quite unique so that as I apply it, we get various colors within the rock. When you do this, you have to be careful that nothing's too saturated and that the value isn't too dramatically different, but I think this is a really good range. And now, we're following a similar rule to when we initially applied it, in that the top of each rock structure or horizontal sheet of rocks is the area in which we will apply the most light, and then it'll dissipate as we work down. This time, however, we're working around some added greens. My brush is still quite damp, so our applications will be semi-transparent. Not necessarily a bad thing. Allows us to work more subtly. It means that it takes more time to build the painting, right? Because we have to do the extra layers, but I feel like a lot of the lessons on this channel are 3 to 4 hours. So, might as well take our time and do it right, right? You know, I say that, but you could definitely spend 2-3 hours on just this, augmenting the color, doing all of those changes. So when you look at this, I want you to recognize that while it may end up looking good, you could make it even better with some extra time and care. I am limited by the fact that this needs to be a digestible lesson and therefore needs to be created in a certain period of time, but you can spend as long as you want on any of these individual pieces and come up with something pretty spectacular. I'm just going to go up into some of the more green areas, just add touches of the rock showing through even higher up, where the majority of the bottom is rock. The top is more sparse. And again, we don't want to do too much in here, but we can definitely continue leading the eye and create some unique little happenings. Just like that. I also don't like to mix with this brush, but when we have an extremely small amount that we want of paint, we can do so with the liner. And here you can see I'm just creating a slightly brighter variant that'll allow us to highlight very particular rocks and pieces of them. Always starting at the top. I'm not outlining the tops, by the way. I'm just going in with some taps and allowing the eye and the mind to kind of fill in the blanks visually. And that's important. Less is more. Less is often more. And if it's not, it's easy to go back in and add. Beautiful. Like that a lot. So from there, we let it all dry, and I drew on roughly where my waterfall is going to be, as well as some additional foliage, which will add to create some additional depth in a little bit. But right now, we're focusing on the waterfall, and I'm doing so with a liner brush. So something with a lot of sharp detail. Now I'll head to our palette, and typically I don't like to mix with this brush, but we don't need an abundance of paint, so it's okay. I'll take that titanium white, move it down towards the bottom. We'll grab a hint of Mars Black, maybe 1/10 of what we had in the titanium white. That way we have a light gray. Then we'll interject just a hint of ultramarine blue, so it's slightly a white with a hue to it. And then I'm going to make this semi-transparent. And I'm going to do that by taking my brush, dipping it in some water, taking my paint, moving it to a different area of the palette, going back, grabbing more water, interjecting that into the paint, and now you can see on the palette it's quite transparent. That's great for water because water is, when not dense, very transparent, but additionally it makes it so we have less committal brush applications. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take my pinky finger, ground my hand to eliminate shake, going to head up to the top of the waterfall, and then I'm going to start crafting all of that rushing, falling water. I'm doing a tap and a drag effect for the most part, and I will get you close so you can see the detail and the technique in a second, but I just want to establish the general areas in which we're going to be applying it, so you know. So I'm going back to my palette, when I have new paint, I'm not going to apply it where I left off, because typically where you leave off is a lot more of a watery mixture. You've already used up the majority of your paint. So if you were to go back to there, we'd have something much more stark. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take the majority of that new pigment. I will work it on top of the more prominent areas that I want to further elaborate on towards the top. And then with the excess, I will come back down here and continue to fulfill that progression. So you can see it's going down this way, it's going to come down here, and I think that's enough to get you a little bit closer. So here we are, quite a bit closer. Again, new pigment. I'm going to go back up to the top and layer on additional applications. And I'm doing this predominantly in areas that I want to be a bit more dense, while I'm leaving other areas more open, and that's going to create both depth and texture for us. That said, all of this water is falling. And typically, it has some areas that are a bit more rushing. And then maybe it hits a bit of a rock or something behind and it causes a little bit of a splash, and then it continues to fall. And then we also have purely falling water. So here's a bit more of an elongated set of strokes. Just following the general trajectory of the waterfall. Now I'm going to head back towards the back of the water, because we've done quite a bit on this side and I just want to make sure that we're progressing with balance. So what I'm going to do is now, again, we take the majority of it off the top, and then we're going to work down horizontally, do some taps, bring that together, more taps. Again, we're looking for the idea of falling, so it's a tap and a drag. Then we had this elongated marking over here, we'll do one over here, and it kind of connects back to the series of taps. Try to make sure that it's fairly angled downwards in those scenarios. And now we can head back up here. You notice that I take breaks from going back and completing this top portion, and it's very intentional because we need to let it dry to a point to apply more paint. Because if we just add water to water, it's not going to respond too well. You might end up ripping up what you just put down. But if you let it dry, you can go back in with significantly more water. So it just requires a bit more of a intentional, slower, but safe application. And here, you know, we established both sides. Now I'm going in and I'm filling in this middle section. Initially, it's going to be very transparent, but we will build it up so that it's more akin to the top. Right now, though, it is admittedly going to be in an awkward stage, and we talk about all that all the time. They're inevitable with acrylics, and they aren't a sign that you're doing anything wrong. They are just part of building that foundation, and that's okay. What you need to do is have faith in yourself, have faith in the process, see it through, and I'm very confident you'll be happy, if not ecstatic, that you did. Because it's through that persistence and that perseverance
that we really grow to appreciate that which we're doing and trying to achieve. And when we do finally achieve it, well, it's just the best feeling, isn't it? There we go. Any area that might be hitting a rock underneath gets extra attention because the water is coming out this way, which makes it visually more dense between the eye and the back of it. You can see that this does take a little while, but that's okay. It is a fun process. Continuously going back to the palette. You can see I'm finding new areas to start on. Initially it was just the top, which we can continue to go back to, but now we have additional layers that we can build up. There we go. We're also going to be trying to create a lot of unique portions and intricacies within this, so that the water develops as it falls. Because initially it's going to be very choppy at the top. You'll have all of this texture, all of this tapping, and then as we get towards the bottom it becomes more of a falling. So elongated strokes. Sometimes I get questions in the comments, how do you paint a waterfall? Or how do you paint clouds? And the best answer, the most truthful answer, the answer that will get you the farthest long term, is that there isn't a singular way to paint clouds, waterfalls, mountains, anything. There are techniques that aid you in very specific variants and portions of all of those subjects, but all of those subjects are made up an amalgamation of different techniques and application styles. It's rarely ever just one. And it's better to look at your subject as a collection of shapes, patterns, and textures, rather than a cloud, a waterfall, a mountain. It'll just lead you to being more successful long term. And I think that was a lesson that really helped me with learning how to paint. I think we'll head down here, do something similar to this, but I'm going to make sure that it's lower than that one so that we don't accidentally create an unnatural symmetry. So as I get to about the middle area of the waterfall, rather than it being a tap and a little drag, it's a tap and a longer drag. Let's get you a bit farther back though. Now as we continue to progress downwards here, as noted, our technique is going to change a little bit, but it's also going to go through a transitionary amalgamation. And that's going to happen throughout the center here. So we're doing taps and drags towards the center of the waterfall, be it a little bit longer than what we were doing, but that is still a technique we are imposing. And then we're going to start, and I'm starting it with a brighter pigment, a much more full pigment, just to show you, though this is typically something I'd build up. We're going to create areas of falling water like this, where it kind of acts as a bowl, right? That's the bottom shape. And the top has liquid that's flying out of it, as if the bowl is falling and liquid is flying out one side, but then maybe also the other side a little bit. And then we do some little taps towards the bottom so that we don't have a clean spherical bottom, it's a bit more organic. And then that technique builds into these larger vertical falling pieces like that. And individually, admittedly, it looks a little awkward. I get that. And that's okay. Because as we start to build them up, and we gradually add, it's going to be significantly less so. But again, it's important that we don't have them all end on the same horizon line. There we have another longer horizontal marking. And then there's little taps and drags. I'm going to go up and I'm going to soften the top here a little bit. Just work it over, work it over, work it over. Maybe use my finger to soften, drag. Never get too old for finger painting, but if you do finger paint here, this is very important. Make sure that you have recently washed your hands with soap. Why is that? Because oil is built up on our hands. And if we have a grand amount of them, they're going to make processes like this difficult. Because if the canvas adopts those oils, then it can have issues holding and picking up water. So you'll have areas where you go to apply a watery pigment and it just doesn't stick. It wants to move away from that area. And it's frustrating, because there's nothing there that we can see, but it's just the oils from your hands that have transferred. And it can be avoided, again, if you recently washed your hands with soap, which is something I try to frequently do while I paint, just in case I do want to go in with my hand. And typically, there are paintings where that's more prominent than others. Those paintings include ones with semi-transparent subjects, like water. So just larger ideas to keep in the back of your head through your painting processes. You can see how thin all of this is in relation to the top. The fact that we need to build this out, make it a bit more prominent, a bit more opaque in select areas. I used to try really hard to be quick and concise with all of these applications for the sake of teaching. And I still do it to an extent, because I want these to be digestible, right? I recognize that not everybody can watch a 4-hour lesson, but sometimes they do end up being 4 hours because I want you to have that information. But here today, we really are just taking our time, because the more time you spend taking it in, adjusting, making those micro adjustments, the better it's going to be. This is really one of those subjects that is aided by patience and not just going in and applying paint in the most cathartic, quick way possible. We're a bit more dependent, or our future strokes are much more dependent on our past strokes, rather than having everything kind of happen and go together at once. Towards the bottom, it's going to be much more of a real fall, but I do need more pigment. Still using the same mixture, essentially. That is a massive amount of titanium white, then a little bit of our Mars black and ultramarine blue. By the way, ultramarine blue is a warm blue. What does that mean? Different colors, all colors, reds, blues, purples, greens. They have warm and they have cool variants. And you typically select them to match the atmosphere that you want to portray. Now, we have a waterfall here, but I want it to be a warm painting. I want you to feel as if you can have a t-shirt on, or you can go swimming, or you can really just explore freely, right? So I went with a warmer blue rather than a cooler blue. A cooler blue would be something like a cerulean. So if you want your waterfall to have a bit more of a different atmosphere, then you can use something like that. Also, why is water blue? Water is only ever blue because it is reflecting something that is blue. The sky here, blue. You can't see it, but it's implied by the fact that the water has a little bit of that hue in it. You can also add it to some of your greenery should you want to. But I would like to note that we're not painting the waterfall with blue because it's water and water is blue, because that is not the case. Water is a collection of the hues that it reflects. That is important to note. You could also add green into this, but we're already getting green in it because it is a lot of semi-transparent applications, right? And those show the green through them. You can see how I'm moving into a lot of these longer falling lines. But I'm not giving up on the textures and the details. And here you can see some of those textures and details are overlapping the more vertical strokes. Let's get you a little bit closer. So, yet again, a little bit closer. Yet again, thinning my water and my paint. Now, heading in to thicken areas that need thickening and building in this larger negative space. So here's a different technique. I'm actually going to take the side of my brush, which has paint, and I'm going to work my way up. I'm going to do a little bit of blending to both sides, like so. Go back to our pigment, and we will do it again in a slightly different area because it definitely has too much water to rework on already. And this is going to give us a slightly more misty look to the water as well. We're going to have quite a bit of that towards the bottom. And I think I'm just about to exceed the amount of water I can have in this area while still wet. So, this needs to be a lot thicker, but it's a good first layer. While we wait for it to dry, we're going to head back up here and continue to confirm some of the more stark movements within the water. The less soft applications, the ones that are pattern driven and to a greater degree determine movement, shape, texture all of that. You can also do a technique that's similar to pointillism, where we've been crafting these falling bowl-like shapes, but you don't actually have to make markings like that. You can do it all via taps, right? And then because those taps are very close to one another, they visually assume the general shape that we want to imply. And in those elongated portions, all of those vertical markings, I do like to go up to the top and do a couple little taps like that and draw them back in. It's a subtle detail that, if you do it everywhere, can add a lot of extra realism. It's almost like adding sparks to a fire through all of those little taps. Adds so much more magic with ease. There we go. Again, looks really awkward with that being as transparent as it is, while everything else is definitive, where this should be the most opaque part with the exception of the very top. But that's just something we accept and we handle over time. I think I want to let this dry for the most part, and then I'll come back and jump back. And I also want a couple of minutes to digest it, look at it from different distances, and just make sure that it's progressing as a whole the way I want it to. So, it's been about 5 minutes, and things have dried in their entirety, which is nice. Which means I can head back in, build up the bottoms down here. Might even connect it to that before I build it up, just so that I have the placement I want. You can see that I'm also getting a bit of a granular texture to a point, and that's because I don't have a massive amount of water on my brush. With the previous applications, you saw that I took the paint, I moved it here, I grabbed more water, I worked it in. Here, because I want this to be more opaque, I'm actually just going in with a damp brush, because I almost always make my brush damp before I apply pigment. But because of that, we're getting larger amounts of paint that are being applied, and they're catching the grain of the canvas, and they're not filling it in entirely because it doesn't have that much water. So we're getting that granular effect, as I noted, and that's actually something I wanted. Why? Because it looks like all of those little taps that we did up here, except we don't have to do the taps. We let the mediums of the canvas and the pigment do that work for us. You can tell this area looks very empty now as that builds and that builds. We'll have to come back and fill that well. You can do that through taps, which lead into this larger area, and then this larger area. More falling. Because I didn't incorporate as much water, I can also go over this multiple times without having to take those elongated breaks, because it's drying quicker. That's another benefit of water typically, is that it keeps your paint wet longer, which with acrylics is very valuable. But it does mean the process takes longer, and it doesn't necessarily have to. Because water is a tool, an aid, not something mandatory. Starting to get there. Let's build up a bit more pigment. You can see we're getting faster with our mix as we go. Go back up here, reapply, and it's more stark than it was before. But remember, it's not because our pigment changed, because it didn't. We're still using the same hue, we're still using the same value, but because we're building a light pigment on top of a light pigment rather than a light pigment on top of a mid to dark pigment, it shows up much better. So you don't have to adjust your mix, you just need to layer. See that slowly we build it. Now the waterfall, while it is our main subject, is something we do have to be slightly careful with. Because we don't want to make it overly detailed to the point where everything else looks unnaturally not detailed, right? It's all about finding a balance. So while we could continue to add detail and build on this waterfall for, another half an hour, I think what really would be the smart thing to do is maybe spend another 2-3 minutes fixing up some areas, filling out portions that need to be filled out, but then we take a break and we work on other things. And then we can come back to this once we have an idea of how much detail is in the rest of the painting. That way it all progresses naturally. And we don't have to go back and take away details. We can work more additively. That said, I did want to brighten up the bottom. Adding slightly more pressure at the bottom and then relieving as I work my way up. That way I get a bigger brush stroke on the bottom. And then I might do a little bit of a swirl at the very bottom. Make it wet, quite wet. Build out our mist. You want to be careful that the majority of this is dried first though, because if it hasn't, then you will rip up that paint and make it look semi-transparent again, which is something you don't want. And this is something that can and will be done in many a layer. I think I need to let that dry. I'll get you closer, we'll do more with the mist, and then we'll proceed. On second thought, we're not going to do the mist in abundance down here yet because I want to do the water. Then, when the water is done, we can do the mist. We want to do it in that order because the mist is not only working horizontally, but it's also moving out towards us, right? It's going to overlap the water that is filling the pool down here, essentially, or the lake, or whatever it may be, but this general pool of water. So I'm going back to the 1-inch flat-headed brush, and as we noted, water is a collection of the colors that come in and reflect on it. So for this, I'm actually going to do a combination of the sap green as well as the ultramarine blue. Give us a nice, deep, rich, bluish green. Then we're going to desaturate it just a little bit so that it doesn't conflict with everything else by adding titanium white, and we'll darken it with about an equal mixture of Mars black. And this should render a really nice, dark, greenish blue. We can interject a little bit more blue in there. Perfect. You can also test it on your reference photo if you want an exact color match. But it is our first layer, so I'm going to have to go over it again anyway. It's not perfect, that's okay. We're testing the waters, essentially. And I'm using the 1-inch flat-headed brush because A, I can mix an abundance of paint, B, I can apply an abundance of paint, and C, as you can see, I can use the sharp edges to cut around the rocks that will be in the foreground. There we are. I'm going to make this a little bit higher. You can really tell just how thin these acrylics can be in this application. This is a prime example of why we do many layers. You might also wonder, what do we do right here? That will probably likely just be quite a bit of mist. So we're going to let that dry, probably take 5 minutes, maybe 10 depending upon where you are, but we'll go back in, we'll do a second layer, and then we'll proceed. Also, when you take these little breaks, make sure you have some water, have a little snack. It really does make a difference. If you're not eating and drinking, your hands do get shaky, and we don't want that, right? We want a good, healthy painting experience. So, we've given it some time, feels decent, and I'm going to go back in with a secondary layer. This time, you can see that we have much more of the actual color, rather than the color with a light background working through it, making it look brighter, bringing more attention to the saturated hues within it. This looks a bit more muted now that it's thick. Just like that. And this is very much what I wanted. I'm going to just sharpen this edge slightly, but to be honest, it doesn't really matter because we're going to be putting an abundance of mist on this line here. But in case we don't want to apply it somewhere, now we have more of an option of where we do and where we don't. We can also make the bottom a bit brighter. So interject some titanium white into that mix. And why do we do this? Because it is reflecting to a point all of the water that is above it. So I'll just work that right underneath the waterfall, and then I'll have it blend outwards to the left and right. Like so. You can see that it's a bit darker, a bit more rich through there, but it's all very subtle. It's not a dramatic change. And that is intentional. Maybe one more application. Every application gets a little bit brighter, but not dramatically because we're blending wet into wet rather than wet into dry. There we go. Again, once that dries, we head in with our mist and we make this bottom area look quite nice. Now everything is fully dry to the touch, and I'm switching to a 1/3 inch filbert brush. This one is great because it has a bit of a rounded edge, which will give us a softer application than what a flat-headed brush could accomplish. But it also has a nice sharp edge to it, so we can render detail if we want to. I'm going to begin by making sure it's nice and damp, as we do. Grab some of that titanium white, hint of our blue, though when we go for a blue, we now have to be careful not to grab an area that was diluted by any of the green, because we don't want that in our mist. And then we'll go and we'll grab a small amount of Mars black. So rendering a very similar pigment to that which we've done before. I'm going to really thin this, so I take the extra pigment off, I go in, I grab water, and I'm slowly just bringing it that way. Now I'm going to start by using the majority of the pigment on that, and then using the edge of the brush, because it's rounded, I'm going to work in circular strokes here. They're very tight circular strokes. And then I'll make them wider and wider. Just like that, working up. It's making the bottom much more opaque. And remember, it moves outwards just a little bit. So we'll also do that around the base of the waterfall. Have it dissipate, especially as you move towards the right-hand side. Now I'll go back. I'm going to grab a bit of a thicker amount for this area of negative space I didn't paint in earlier. That was a mistake, by the way. You can and should paint that in, but it's a very easy fix, as I'm about to show you, where we just go on with additional paint, thick paint, and we fill that area in. There we go. We build it up slowly over time. We don't want anything too thick too early, because it's much easier to add in more paint than it is to take paint away. We don't want to bring this too high, otherwise it makes the waterfall feel shorter. And I'm trying to essentially eliminate the hard edge that we have just right here in the middle of the waterfall. And then we'll soften. Again, something we can add a lot more to, but I want to be careful with it, not overdoing it, and it's something we can go back to a little bit later in the painting. But for now, I'm going to take that brush, put it down, put it away, because we're going back to the 1 inch, which we're making nice and damp. The foreground here is an amalgamation of rocks and foliage, but what it needs is a dark base. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to grab some of my Mars Black, grab a hint of our titanium white, and then a good abundance of our sap green, probably about 1/3 sap green to the Mars Black mixture, with again a hint of white, and we're just going for a very organic shadow color, something we can build on top of. We're very close to the foreground, so we can work with stark values and more saturated pigments. I'm using the 1 inch brush because it's allowing me to cut along these sharp edges, and that's important because we are going to be painting rocks, and well, they aren't soft, right? Not visually, not physically. So we're just working this along these edges. You can see that as it gets more thin, the green reveals itself. And if it's thick, it looks a bit more like a black. We do need to make it thick, but it is a good example of that white of the canvas showing through in the initial layers and how it changes the colors in which we apply. Now I want this to all look very consistent. Right now it's far from it, and that's okay. Here, look at that. Same pigment, exact same color. Very different results. So I'll just keep mixing, keep building these darker base layers, and I'm going to bring it out all the way to the side here. Now there isn't too much point in adding extra paint right now because it's so wet. Probably take another little break, do some dishes. But what else you could do is fill in this area. And you know what? That's probably what we'll do. I'll move the camera back, we'll do this, we'll jump back to that. We don't need to do a break. I may or may not have been looking for an excuse to get the dishes done. You know how it is, being an adult and whatnot. So, taking a couple steps back, still going to work on this spot while the bottom dries, grabbing an abundance of that Mars Black, sap green, hint of titanium white, really not changing anything from what we were doing down there, though as we progressively move upwards, we can make it slightly less dark and stark. Why is that? because we're moving slowly farther away as we get towards the top here with our foliage. And when subjects are very close up, typically you see their innate coloring, their saturation, their values to a greater degree. And then as you get farther away, you have a lot more atmospheric light reflecting onto it, changing the hues and the values. So that could be brighter. That said, I think in the time that I moved the camera and did all of that, the bottom area started to dry. It did. Excellent. So I'm going to go in and do my second layer. You can see it's really starting to look different. And we are going to have rocks, foliage around here, so it doesn't have to be perfect. You can have brush strokes showing or textures. It really will add a little bit of life to it, but I do want a good thick application of pigment because that will make a dramatic difference in how professional the piece looks in the end. Also, as you move up here, again, we're going to make it a little bit brighter. Extra titanium white, extra sap green. Not dramatically, but a little bit. The best paintings are done in and with subtlety, right? You know what, that's not always true. Sometimes there are very bold, in-your-face paintings, and they are wonderful. I think on average, a more subtle painting is a better painting from a technical perspective, but there are paintings that break that rule, and it's really neat when they do. So don't feel like you can't paint a bold scene. Just recognize it'll probably be a little bit harder to balance. With that, switching back to the 1/3 inch filbert, grabbing this pigment, and I'm going to apply foliage along the edge. Notice how we left a couple millimeters around all of it? That was intentional so that we could go in with this brush and get a much sharper, finite application. That said, you are quite far away, and this is a very detailed application. So, I think we'll get you a bit closer. So, a little bit farther back, and a lot of this is similar to the initial application processes of when we go to apply it along the edge, we go in with a very minimal amount of pressure, and then we apply more towards the middle of the body of the piece of foliage. Also, using a slightly darker green that I grabbed on my palette, and because of that, to keep things cohesive, I'm going to work it back into the negative space to a point. That way I get a little bit of a pattern, and it all just fits together nicely. I'm also trying to really ensure that there's no white of the canvas showing through. There are a couple of spots there, but I'll go back to them when I have slightly more dry space to work on. And then the foliage is going to change in style as we get down here, where it's going to be more draping foliage. More of the aesthetic of a fern, essentially. Just going to mix more paint. This brush is big enough to mix paint. Not hyper effectively like the 1-inch flat, but still effectively. And these edges can be a little bit brighter because we're towards the edge of this mass. And as a result, it'll catch more light, as we noted the light's coming in this way. So it's not dramatically different, but it is different. Just painting in a little bit of potential subtle detail. You can see the water on both sides. We're creating some depth. And now I'm just bouncing around and doing some more of that tapping effect, that tap and drag, just to make it all come together. Now, once this is fully dry, we're going back in with the 1/3 inch filbert because we want to craft this foliage, but we want to make it larger than what we did in the background using the liner brush. So, bigger brush, one that will still let us render sharp markings should we choose, and again, we can blend with it. Now, with this, we're going to go for a green that's a bit brighter than what we used for that darker base, but not dramatically so. We want to be able to slowly build up how bright this green is. So we're going to try this. I'll take the excess pigment off my brush because you don't want to go in with too much or it's difficult to apply detail. Grab that. I'll head into the edge and then I'll work my way backwards until I find that it essentially just makes sense to turn into this darker void, right? But we want everything to have a little bit of this pattern. And you might not even be able to see this honestly in the camera. I don't know that I can see it in the viewfinder, but I think that's actually good because it shows you that the first application here really is meant to be quite subtle. And we're only really going to handle the top area with a little bit of transition down into here because this is going to be a different type of foliage. But we apply this towards our edges and then we go in for something brighter. So double up on my green, a little bit of extra titanium white, get a good even mix. I don't have too much paint on my brush, so I don't feel like I have to wipe off the excess this time. Go into those edges. When I go in for these taps and drags, remember we go in with minimal pressure, we add pressure, and then we remove the pressure as we remove the brush. So it goes from a sharp application to a wide to a sharp. Like an eye, essentially. Remember, you'll do a lot better at painting things like foliage or anything in nature if you simplify it down into a shape rather than a subject. And here, we're dealing with a lot of eyes. They can overlap each other. They can move on different directions. Some should be hanging because of gravity. There's some will be pulled upwards as they grow. So you want diversity within them. But it's also important to remember that we're on the hard left-hand side and we want leading lines that move the viewer's eye back into the painting. So a lot of my strokes are moving this way rather than this way. Let's make it brighter. Let's make it more green. And this is something you can tell I'm not really waiting for it all to dry. We're not using a grand amount of paint, so it's not taking a long time to dry, but we're also jumping around a lot. We do this, and then we work our way down here, and in the process that it takes to get down there and apply that pigment, typically the top has dried. There we go. Again, this is applied to the edge, and then we let it dissipate as you move back. We do want this darker backing. It acts as a nice vignette, and it makes sense because the light is coming this way. I know you're still quite far away, but it isn't a difficult technique. It isn't an unintuitive technique. And what's most important that you pick up from me doing this right now is how these colors are working with these colors, how the colors are working together, how the strokes are looking at everything from a distance. We will get you closer, but it just hasn't been the time yet. I always preface that because sometimes I get comments saying, oh, it'd be great if you moved us closer. And sometimes that's true, but sometimes it genuinely is more beneficial if you're a bit farther back. Be more beneficial if I were farther back. Grab some extra white, grab some extra green. You notice the pattern? We're just slowly brightening it. And again, we're closer, so the green can be more saturated, vibrant, brighter than that which we've applied before. Our markings are larger than that which we've done before. There we go. It's looking quite nice. I like that. Sometimes you may make an application that's a little bit too big, like that. It's okay. We can work it back using some darker pigments. Just kind of cut it in half. You can also use darker pigments to open up areas or create larger shadows and openings, because you do want larger openings within this as well. They kind of allude to the fact that this foliage can be deep and doesn't get a lot of light everywhere. Let's make it brighter again. And that's probably as bright as I want to go for this layer. Later on in the painting process, we have the option of going brighter, but I do want to take my time with that, because much like the waterfall, the amount of detail in it, the brightness over here, I want to evolve everything naturally, and that will be best accomplished if we are a bit more reserved in our application style, at least initially. Okay. Could use some work, no doubt about it. Some refining. But as a whole, it's doing what we want it to. There we go. Now for the foliage down here, I'm going to go back to the 1-inch brush just to do my mixing, and I'm going to mix up a fairly bright green, not as bright as the highlight that we were just working with, because I do want to be able to build it up to some extent, but I want it to be quite a bit brighter than this. So I'll do a little test. I think that's actually great. I'll get the majority of the paint off this brush, and then I'm switching to the liner brush. Now we still want markings larger than this. Well, we're going to use this brush anyway, because the type of foliage is very much elongated. We're going to be making longer strokes rather than taps, and should all work out quite well. So here's what I'm doing. Creating the spine of our plant, and then all of the little offshoots to the left and right, just like that. Easy. Now we'll have another one going like that. We'll have another one come in through there. Sometimes I like to paint multiple at the same time just so I can get an idea of movements and composition. Again, this is something you can copy piece by piece in the reference photo, but I want to take some artistic liberties. I made these slightly bigger than they are in the reference photo, and I want to make this foliage slightly bigger as well. And I'm doing that so that it looks closer to us. I just want to create a little bit more depth in the painting. And by making this foliage significantly larger than this foliage, we show that this is so much closer. Here, they're going and intersecting. Having them cross paths is very important occasionally. It can look messy, so be careful and don't rush into it. But it is something that happens very naturally, and if you were to avoid it entirely, you'd end up with something that looks artificial. Love pre-mixing this much paint. Typically, when I start a painting, I try not to mix a grand abundance of any pigment so that I have to go through the process of really learning my mixes, practicing them, perfecting them. That way when I want to take that pigment into another painting down the line, I know exactly how to get to it. I've done the practice, I've memorized it. But once you have those colors down, and in scenarios like this where the colors aren't necessarily complicated, they're not a mix of multiple hues, then mixing the abundance, I don't think there's an issue with it. And if anything, again, it's just a great time saver, so you can focus more on the actual painting with your time. That said, color mixing and doing so well is definitely worth your time. Makes such a big impact in final paintings. Much like a lot of this, by the way, these are directional. They're working towards the right. My brush is quite damp through the entirety of this process. To paint these, they're a bit farther down. They're quite detail oriented, so I'm kind of rounding my back a little bit. It's not the best posture, but it is a reminder that if you are also just kind of putting your body in a strange position to paint, typically you can raise your easel up and down. You can paint standing up if you have the canvas kind of fixed to a desk. Doesn't just have to stay exactly where it is. I find when I paint elaborate skies, something I really like to do is move the easel, the canvas, so that the sky is about right under my shoulder, because it's the most natural position to paint from. So I can paint more quickly without having to move or contort my body. Why is that important very specifically in complex skies? Because typically you're fighting dry time, and if you can just make yourself physically comfortable, you will be more relaxed, focused, and able to accomplish things in a more timely manner. Slowly filling these out. We will need to go in and add some levels of highlight. Not quite there yet. There we go. And this will also eventually work its way down into the ground, where we'll also place rocks and grass a lot of other subjects. If you're wondering why I'm getting quieter in this part of the process, it's just because it requires a lot of thought. And kind of using intuition, but again, trying to push a lot of it this way while also feeling like it's layered on top of itself, while not making it too overly busy. And this is a section, I will say, that is a little more tricky than any other. And if you really don't like the way it looks after this layer, let it dry, paint the darker layer on top of it, and you can do it again. I do that sometimes with this type of foliage, and it's often a lot easier than trying to overly fix it. If there are minor fixes, then great. But if as a whole you aren't really happy with it, then a fresh start is quite easy at this point. And there's nothing wrong with that, by the way. You shouldn't feel like you failed or you can't do it often with these paintings. I will try things on other canvases, or I'll do the lesson 2 or 3 times, or the first version isn't what I end up putting up, and that's okay. We learn as we do things. They get better. The first try doesn't have to be the most incredible thing of all time. As long as you're enjoying the process, you're learning, you're getting better, it's great. There we go. Now we're going to head back to the 1-inch flat and build a much brighter variant of our green, but not that bright. We still want room to brighten it if we so choose. So we'll go for something brighter than that what we have, but still with room to grow. Now back to the smaller brush, and you can see that it's quite dramatic in regards to the variance. I'm being very delicate to make the smallest applications possible, and right now I'm just going over the spines. And not even all of the spines. Mostly the spine that is on the top, but also occasionally the bottom if it's in the direction of the light. Here's a really big one. And even on the big ones, I try to make my markings somewhat smaller. I'm also going to throw in a couple in the negative space just to fill it out. When part of the spine is facing the left-hand side, I likely won't touch it at this point. And I'm rotating myself around the canvas so that I have the best ability to make these markings. I've been doing all of this from quite a distance because I think the most important thing is balance here, having it with everything else, but I think we're just about at the point where I can get you closer as I start working on some of the offshoots and real details now that we've kind of established the larger space. Now, something else noteworthy about what we're doing here is that not all plants are the same level of brightness. They don't all consist of the same greens. So despite the fact that this is right next to another very green, bright plant, this one doesn't have to be that bright. It doesn't have to be that saturated or unsaturated. It can have its own unique characteristics. And I note that so that you don't accidentally end up making them look like the same plant. My current goal is to brighten, but not overcomplicate, to layer and create depth, but not to overcomplicate. So there's a couple of goals. There we go. Okay. Now, we've done one layer of the highlights on the spines. Once I find areas that have dried that I really like, I go back and I do a second. Because every time we build over a lighter layer, we make it even brighter. We don't need to mix a brighter pigment most of the time. We just need to go over it again. And don't forget to let this extend past the darker bodies and base, as that will also help it look natural. There we go. Slowly making them bigger, slowly building up the light, slowly really liking it. Now, while the majority of the time we don't need to make it brighter because we just need to do more layers, I am going to make it a little bit brighter. I'm not going to make it more saturated though, and there's a difference. When we add the titanium white, we make it brighter. When we add more of the sap green, we lessen the amount of Mars black in the mixture essentially, because typically we're also adding titanium white, and that gives us a more saturated pigment. This time, I'm just going for a brighter pigment. So it'll be a different look than what we have up here, but it'll still look like it's catching some nice light. And I'm following the initial rule of just where the light is going to be touching, starting predominantly with spines, but also occasionally diving into the edges. And we're doing much more of it towards the center than we are the left-hand side. There we go. I think we're almost done with these for now. And we'll probably leave them in a similar spot to the water and most everything else, where we'll go back and we'll add to it later if it makes sense to balance the piece. but we don't want to overdo it. Throwing in a couple of strays, as they will add a good amount of realism. And when I do these, I like to hold my brush from farther back to eliminate intention and just get a good flow. Something a bit more unique that I might not have come up with had I tried to get it. So I like that. Let's get you closer, do some grass. Now I don't want to start the grass with something quite as bright as what we currently have, so I'll add some extra green and Mars Black to the mixture. Get more of a mid-green, not too saturated. The liner brush, and then we're going to have a good amount of grass coming out from this area. I'm not going to make the strokes as large and prominent as we did over here, but they will eventually move over here and essentially turn into something that's quite cohesive. I'm also going to interject the occasional longer stroke, probably from this dense area, into it, and it'll cut across other portions of the grass to make it more dynamic. A lot of this grass is moving in this direction still for leading line's sake. We'll also move it down. You want your brush to be extremely damp. It's going to thin the paint so your marks are semi-transparent, but it's really going to pull those bristles together and give you something that's a lot sharper, which is currently our primary goal. I'll skip a little bit of an area, leaving space for rocks and whatnot. And then as my pigment runs out, I'll do a little bit towards the left-hand side, but not much. There we go. We can also do a little bit of grass over here, maybe in between where we'll have a couple of rocks. Not too much. And for now, let's leave that. And I'm going to grab some additional burnt umber for our rocks so they're cohesive with those. Okay, so for this, we'll grab our burnt umber, a little bit of our sap green so that, again, it fits within the context of everything else. Just like that. Nice and earthy. A little bit of Mars Black, titanium white. And we're essentially building up just the first layer of what will be quite nice. Doesn't have to be perfect in that the mix can have a little bit more white, a little bit more green. If it ranges, that actually isn't awful because it'll just make for a more unique application. Less control, but more natural variance. And what I'm going to do is, again, rocks that are going to catch a light, we paint those in first. Typically it'll be the tops of them. And I like to think of this as essentially sheets. And then whenever the rock moves down this way, like in this portion, we're not going to do any light. Or at least not much. We might do some as the pigment starts to run off of the brush and we're left with a very watery, semi-transparent amount like this. But certainly not when we're just starting. We'll also head into these areas, occasionally overlapping our grass, having it get lost within the grass. You can do a tap and a drag to get it a bit more bumpy, which isn't a bad look at all. And then we can have more of just a natural dirt through here. And when I paint dirt, I like to do a lot of little taps and drags, similar to what we did with the foliage, but instead of having it kind of fall, it's more horizontal. And if you go over the grass, that's okay, because we can always repaint in the grass. Typically, that's a better option than avoiding it, because if you just avoid it, then you end up with edges that look very unfinished. And then again, it dissipates as you move towards the left, much like the grass. Gets darker. All right, looking in the viewfinder, very difficult to tell. Let's get you closer. Maybe the theme of this particular lesson is that the first layer of paint is typically really difficult to distinguish in detail, because it's just so subtly different from the base. And that's okay. That's actually, again, in a lot of scenarios, a good thing. So just getting comfortable with that idea. Now let's make it brighter. And I'm going to add some extra Mars Black because I don't want it to be overly saturated. And here you can see I'm making a very messy mix. See that? There are different hues, saturations, values all throughout. And I want it that way, because it means that my rocks are going to be continuously diverse. Going in with these taps along what will be the tops, just giving it a really rough aesthetic and texture, bringing it over into the dirt, having it dissipate. We'll go back, we'll do more. I grabbed a slightly brighter variant of that pigment, and as you can see, it builds that highlight nicely. We will go in and we'll add grass into this, but I didn't want to do it first because we'd end up covering it up and having to redo it. Also, this, that, and that all look very similar in terms of their shape and their size. That is bad. That is not what we want to happen. So I'm looking at the reference photo. The reference photo has it much more diversified than what I've done. I kind of tried to simplify this portion so that it didn't take away from the actual waterfall. But if you want it to be hyper detailed, then you can follow the reference photo, and I'll probably draw it like the reference photo on the traceable. But here, I kind of want to show you just how you go about painting these things, so that when you want to paint them in your own lessons or in your own paintings, you know how to do that. It's not just about copying a photo. So here you can see we have all these divots, areas that are kind of sunken in. We're not collecting as much light. We diversified our 3 sections of rock. The rock that leads into dirt is also different, though we can add additional highlights to it as well. Just keep the same general idea that it dissipates. Now let's make it into a nice moss that can work up and around a lot of this, create new pathways for our rocks. Layer it on top of the highlights because it will get those highlights. Mix it in, but don't make it messy. Let's make it brighter. Again, just using this tiny little brush. And this is going to make it look wet, having that brighter sheen to it. I'm not applying this everywhere, it's reserved for a couple standout spots. We're just building building these highlights. You can also use it to render brighter grass towards the edge that'll catch light. It will also work on top of these rocks, and you can also throw it behind them, or it's growing on them. See that? Now on the left, or on the right hand side, when I go to paint the grass, you notice that it's moving in towards the center. So the grass is moved in terms of how it's being angled, which means there isn't a hard wind, it's just naturally how the grass is moving. Though if you want to present a hard wind in a painting, perhaps it's a stormy piece, then all of your foliage, grass, everything should be leaning in the same direction. When you have it go in different directions, it alludes to it being a bit more calm, which is what I want for this one. Lots of little taps and attention to detail. Where in the foreground we will see that real detail. There we go. Let's do a high piece or two. Something to build height. Just because this is very level, and it's very level with that, I want to kind of break that rule a little bit. Might be a little large. Just adding some rock back into that area, maybe building it up a little bit higher. Upon stepping back, I've realized that I want more diversity in the bottom. So that is a technique in which we can do it. Here's something else we can do. We can take some titanium white and we'll mix it over here, and take some Mars black, probably about 1/5 of what we want against the titanium white. Then we'll grab a little bit of our burnt umber, not much. We'll grab a little bit of our sap green, not much. And we'll build an earthy gray. And we'll implement a different kind of wet rock. I'm going to go in with some taps. And some drags. Working over a lot of moss and greenery. Things you don't have to do if you do this from the start. But I just wanted more variety in the hues that we were working with, because we had all of this brown here and here, and we have green everywhere, but we don't have a lot of gray, with the exception of in the waterfall. And I think by making this a bit more of a gray rocky spot, at least over to the right hand side, and not in the true left because I don't want to lose the vignette effect, it'll look like there's a balance, right? Leads you into the piece. You can do a little bit more of it in different areas just to make it cohesive. You can grab the liner brush and throw in little gray rocks in here. You can use the liner brush to really define some of them. and to tap on little details, which is important. We can also make divots using darker pigments, so just a darker gray variant. And this is just to show that even though we've painted it once, it doesn't mean that that needs to be our final version. And there are so many things you can do with rock and moss and foliage. Goes back to what I was saying about how there isn't like one way to paint a rock. There isn't one way to paint grass. There are different types. And it's about discerning which one will work best in the setting that you are currently painting. What builds on the atmosphere to the greatest degree? What helps move the eye? What gives the right pattern and texture? What colors connect? All things to consider. There we go. Just making it look a little bit more wet by splashing on some highlights. Now, as I really stepped back, I realized I want this to be brighter. I want there to be more light moving in from the top. So we're going to do a glaze. Everything's dry, which is mandatory for a glaze. Our brush was just washed thoroughly. Our water was just cleaned. You may not be able to see through the very not clean dish, but it is clean. It's just paint built up from years at this point. But we're going to take our 1-inch clean flat-headed brush. We'll grab some titanium white, move that over here. We'll grab the smallest hint of Mars Black, take the excess off, work that. And now, titanium white and Mars Black are essentially the thickest pigments you can have, which makes them awful for doing semi-transparent applications. A zinc white is technically better for this, but at least for the oils, it's one of those things where it can have negative health impacts over long periods of time, and I just try to avoid it in general so that I don't promote the use of that type of paint, but just general information. That said, we're going to need to add a lot of water to thin it out. So I add some water, I go back, I grab more water, we continue to thin. It's essentially like watercolor, and then I'm going to apply that to the top corner, slowly work my way in towards the waterfall. And by here, it's dissipated. But you have this beautiful light streaming in. I'm just going to turn up the brightness on the camera a little bit so you can really see. We can go back, we can grab a bit more. Just like so. Might work it back a little bit. And it adds a lot of context as to why these areas are highlighted down towards the bottom. And it's something I build up very slowly because it's easy to overdo and difficult to work backwards. If you've never glazed before, I do recommend doing it on a different canvas that you have just laying around, maybe something that didn't totally work out, that you're not in love with. But we still have quite a bit of foliage I want to add, but that foliage is going to be on top of what we're currently doing. So this needs to happen first. That said, if you're happy with how bright the top right corner was already from the previous applications, because we did go into it with the intent of making that corner brighter, then you don't have to do this. This is just for people like myself who want it to be a little bit brighter. And looking in the viewfinder, looking from a distance, I think that looks great. I am quite happy. You know, I say that and I want a little bit more. Just a little bit. Just a little bit. Acrylics dry darker, friendly reminder, and that will impact the glaze. And with a glaze, you're essentially just trying to add hue typically, which doesn't disturb value to a great degree. But here we're actually trying to change value rather than hue. We're not adding in a color or changing a color, we're making an area brighter. So it's a versatile technique, and that worked out well. So with that, we'll let it dry. And while we do, we'll work on some foliage over here. We'll do so with the 1/3 inch brush. Grab some Mars Black, some Sap Green, bit of that titanium white, make a fairly dark green. And I'm going to make the largest, let's make it darker. The largest individual leaves yet. Right now we're essentially just painting silhouettes. And I'm painting them as if they exist with on stems we are yet to paint. And I like to paint the leaves first rather than the stems, because the leaves are really the body of the subject. They are visually what's going to move the eye to a greater degree because they are just larger. And so I feel they're more important, than I kind of connect them later on with that connective tissue. Painting this from a bit of a distance, just so you can see it in scale with everything else, as I try to do. Then we can put that brush down, pick up the liner, make sure it's nice and damp, and then we can connect through branches. I have a lot of pigment on here, starting to lose track. Sometimes I clean my palettes midway through painting, sometimes I don't. Really depends on the painting. Let's get a bit closer though. Here we are, a little bit closer. I'm opting to do more of these, so you'll be able to see up close the techniques that I incorporate. Just like that. Again, a lot of them are pointing in this way. We want some to overlap. All of that's intentional. And I also want to overlap some of this. Why? Because I want to show that it is in front of it, and we're creating a third layer of depth. So we have the background, and then we have this, and now we have what is right in front of it. Easy ways to create depth. Just place subjects in front of each other and make them larger every time you get closer to the audience, the viewer. Again, going in with the foliage first rather than the stems. Quite nice. Now, there's quite a bit over here in the reference photo. Not entirely sure if I want to add that yet. one of those things that we will learn as we go. Now when I paint these branches that connect them, I don't like to make long, soft strokes. I may like to break them up into lots of little pieces and make them a bit more jagged. Feels less artificial that way. There we go. Now, a lot of these aren't facing the light, it's kind of the back. We're not getting that highlight, but the edges, some of the edges will get highlight. So we'll grab some green, some titanium white, mix up a nice bright mixture, hint of our Mars black, not much, taking off the excess. Switching to the liner. And then light's coming in here, so this one is definitely going to get some light on the right-hand side. So we start incorporating that. You can blend it back into this if you'd like to. I'm starting pretty conservatively by not doing so. If I do decide to, it'll take longer because I'm not instigating with it. But it all depends on how thick the foliage is, how strong the light is. There we go. As I say when I look at my palette and I say, where is my paint? What of this is wet? I have no idea. That's okay though. We find it. It's just always a funny experience. I'm not doing all of the leaves. We're not outlining them. We're just looking for the areas that might catch a little bit of that light as it shines on their edge. Now I'll make a brighter variant. So green and titanium white, this time void of the Mars black. It's mixed into the previous mixture, so it does have a little bit of Mars black, but not the same amount. Layer number 2 is brightening up the more prominent pieces and just the more prominent parts of them. So I'm not going over the entirety of the leaf, just the area that will catch the most amount of light. So these all look like they're backlit, essentially, which is a nice unique look. It darkens the top area, which I like, gives us that vignette that we've been working to accomplish in a number of areas. There we are. Okay, so our glaze is dry, and now we're going to head back with the 1/3 inch filbert, grab some of that Mars black, sap a green, mix up a good even mixture, hint of titanium white. So again, we're going for dark, but not to the point where it's a black. You can still see that it's green, it's a bit earthy. And with that, there's a, a very unique foliage on the reference photo on this side. I'm not going to copy that as it is. I want something more akin to what we have here. And you'll see that when we go in to paint it, it's incredibly stark. Really has the opportunity to be special. But it's something that we have to take great care in because it stands out to this degree, right? The more it stands out, the more we have to ensure we do it right. So, I figure we'll have one branch that comes in from here, creates that nice contrast. debating on putting a second leaf here, but I have a lot of these 2-leaf pairings that I'm hesitant to continue. I think I'll start with a second branch down towards the bottom. See how it looks, if I need to continue elaborating on this one. And this one isn't going to go out as far as these do. And that's very purposeful. We'll have some of the leaves overlapping. Having the overlapping leaves means that while we have depth in the background to here, we also have depth within the leaves themselves. And I kind of feel out other areas. We could go lower. There isn't lower in the reference photo. I feel like we don't really need to draw extra attention to there. If anything, we go up higher. And you'll see me place my hand, my brush, over areas and not make the mark, and I'm essentially just making it in my head, seeing if it's something that I like. I also find looking at the viewfinder, I get a much better idea of what I want to do. So again, if you just have a mirror or you do take those steps back, it should do the trick quite well. Want all of these to have nice sharp edges. They need to be well applied and thick. This is again where we make things professional. And I did decide in the end that I do want the 2-leaf structure right here. How am I going to make it better? Add a 3rd leaf and maybe a 4th leaf right here, so that it's not all 2s. Sometimes we can expand and then change that which we've done. Okay, now I want to remix a bit more of that, but we'll throw in a little bit of burnt umber. Not too much. Keep the same value, so the same level of dark to light. Put that down. Switch to the liner brush. Start connecting all of these leaves. Again, I like to do the leaves before I do the branches, because the leaves are really what you notice. They're much larger, they take up the attention. The branches are important, and they can incorporate leading lines, but they're not as impactful. Try to make them as small as you can initially, and then you can expand upon them if you'd like to. I'm going to use the sharp edge of this brush to clean up some of my edges, just like so. Now we'll grab some green, titanium white, a little bit of Mars black, and with this I'm not going to render a bright green at all. We don't need it to stand out against the back because the black is so light itself. And I'll just add a little bit of a green highlight to the tops of all of these leaves using the liner brush. It'll be barely noticeable, but it will add a little bit of dimension. It'll make it cohesive. I'm going to do it on the underside of this, just because of how the light's moving in. And then I'll also make a bit more of a brownish gray, like so. Again, doesn't need to be bright. And we can just add a little bit of a highlight to our branches on this side, just on the tops of them. Try hard not to expand the branch in that process. And let's get a little closer. We painted a lot of this with the 1/3 inch filbert, which is great, but we can refine the edges with the liner. So I'm just going to remix essentially what we had there, doing so a little intuitively, and we found it. We got very lucky. That's great. So we're just going to make the edges a bit sharper, the applications a bit more thick. We can move these down into here just a little bit so that it's cohesive. See that? Don't have to do too much of it, but there were a couple of spots that I saw that I really wanted to address, and this is the right brush and the right time to do it. Now for a very important step, and it's good if you have your water completely clean, your brushes completely clean. We're going to grab some titanium white, dilute it with the smallest amount of Mars Black, grab a bit more titanium white, and we're not going to wetten the brush again. We're going to use this to add the prominent highlights to our waterfall. Starting at the top, working our way down. This will be fully opaque because it doesn't have the added water in it. It'll be slightly more difficult to apply because the water isn't going to condense the bristles to a great extent, but it's going to be done after you have a lot of practice, right? I'm just working my way down. Might grab a little bit of water just so the paint doesn't dry on my brush, but I'll take it off for the most part. And I'll go and I'll reestablish these movements. That said, we are coming to the end of the lesson, and as per usual, I'd like to give you a little keyword you can use in the comment section. Little badge of honor for making it to the end. Typically only 13% of people do in these longer videos, so if you are one of them, congratulations, good for you for putting in the time and really dedicating yourself to getting better at this craft. But if you would like to note that you made it here in a subtle, fun way, we always go with a keyword. We're coming out into this opening. Today the keyword is opening. You can use just that word if you'd like to, or you can incorporate it into a sentence. But that's how I and everybody else who made it this far will know that you got here. Always fun to see who makes it to the end of these. I do check the comments. Also really need to see all of the routine viewers who do so. So if you would like to participate in that, just again, work with the word opening in the comment section of the video. Also, as per usual, big thank you to you for being here. Big thank you to everybody up over on Patreon for making this very long lesson happen. Could not do it if it was not for you and your support. It's because of you that I don't have to run 1,000 ads in videos like this. And it's because of you that lessons like this exist. So thank you for making it a viable way for me to earn a living and teach art rather than in a classroom doing it on the internet. It's quite rewarding to see everybody watching and working on the lessons. Also, if you're new here, again, up over on Patreon, you can find the traceable, so the drawing to help you with the drawing process. You can find all of the materials, pictures of them, so you know exactly what brands I'm using. The brushes are coming out soon. I'll do updates about that on Patreon as well. But you can also get access to all of my ebooks, including Acrylics for Beginners, which is essentially the essentials, everything you need to know about acrylic painting before you jump into your first acrylic painting. There are a bunch of ebooks that have different landscapes, some vertical, some horizontal. There's an ebook on drawing, painting trees, different kinds, breaking it all down. We also have an exclusive Facebook group you can get access to where everybody shares their artwork and leaves supportive comments, helps each other figure out tricky areas. You get to see different renditions of the lessons, which may inspire your own iterations, but it's a really, really supportive, positive community that I am incredibly proud of. I love how that group... Oh, it's getting darker. There we go. I love how that group just treats one another, and it's great to see artists grow through it. So there's the Facebook group, there's the traceables, the ebooks, all of that good stuff up over on Patreon, materials, and it's just a great way to support the channel. That said, if you can't, it's okay. No worries, we have a lot of incredible people who do, and I appreciate all of you regardless. Thank you for being here. Thank you for being a part of the lesson. I will see you soon with a brand new painting lesson, and I hope you have a wonderful time working on this one. Best wishes, and stay creative.